Blessings! This is the Surprise Ending Podcast. We're going to start this with a note about history. Historians disagree a lot, and that is hard for people actually wanting to understand, to pick up a history book, read a historian's record of events and facts, and then it'd be the exact opposite of another historian. For instance, Emperor Constantine. I have read numerous biographies from reputable historians who contradict each other. Some say he was a Christian. No, he's not a Christian, says another. He changed the Sabbath to Sunday, or he made Christianity the official religion. No, another says. It's this way with all history. Even if we agree on the facts, we often disagree on what those facts point to. In the medieval times, we've been told that people lived only to the age of 40. And with taking the average mortality rates of that time, that would be true. But if you went back to the 14th century, you would find lots of people in their late 60s and 70s, like today. The people who were dying were the babies. If you lived past, let's say 4 to 6 years old, and you didn't die of war or plague, your lifespan would look very close to today's lifespans. And there are lots of those misunderstandings about the Middle Ages. So, in the end, we can all create a history that we want, using the sources we decide are correct, and construct an utter fantasy about the past. And I know a lot of people who've done that. And that's why you are seeing so much reconstruction of history today. Because the scholars of today either don't trust the sources of the past or desperately want to change history. So what I plan on doing is posting the sources I use at the end of the podcast, and then you guys can check them out and at least know what sources I'm trusting.
Starting with the Black Plague and weaving through to the present, we reveal how the history of the church is repeating itself in today's headlines. Why you are Catholic and don't know it. This is The Surprise Ending with Teresa Beem.
And today we're going to have the second podcast about the Black Death and how we actually are affected to this day with what happened at that time. Okay, we're going to start with life before the Black Death. Christendom at that time was a well-purring machine. Everyone knew what was expected out of them, and at least in comparison today, it was working well, considering we're a world of sinners. So the church was trusted. In fact, the church bells would ring out what was called the Liturgy of the Hours. It was the set time for prayers, hymns, and Bible readings, which, quote, was marking the hours of each day and sanctifying the day with prayer, end quote.
Right, and these things started in the middle of the night. Night office, at midnight, vigils or matins, M-A-T-I-N-S. Before dawn, they would have what they called lauds. First hour, which was at 6 in the morning, they called prime. Third hour, which is mid-morning about 9 o'clock, was called terce, T-E-R-C-E. And noon was sect, S-E-X-T. Let's see, 3 o'clock in the afternoon would be known or none, N-O-N-E. And 6 p.m. would be what they called vespers, at the lighting of the lamps, which would be kind of cool. And then before bed, they had what they called compline, or night prayer. The heartbeat of time was God. Also, almost everyone went to daily mass as a matter of daily routine, the way we all would watch the news today. So besides tending to God's business, because the clergy were often the most educated people in the city, Civil governments in rural areas gave the church the duty of keeping track of births, marriages, and deaths, as well as being the witnesses in and writing up civil contracts. So they were very, very well thought of. Not only were they well thought of, they kept super accurate records.
So the Black Death comes and takes all of these priests and these people that are keeping every record that there is. In England, we know that we have records that say that in the 1349 Black Death, 3,000 clergy died.
That's just in England?
Yeah. You know, we have two different ways that the clergy reacted. And the first way was the worst as far as the long-term ideas of the church and who the church was. But the clergy, some of them ran away. When the Black Death came, they just took off. And you can understand, everybody was running away. Nobody wanted to die. Think about how, when you saw your clergy running off.
Not to mention, what do you think it would look like to your brother clergy?
Yeah.
That would be really, really difficult
Right.
to see, especially if it was a senior priest who you looked at with respect and honor, and you see him running off. That would just be horrible.
Yeah.
He would like crush the whole area.
Well, the church is built on the structure of the family. So when your father, the man you looked up to, who baptized you and who confirmed you, when he would tell you one day to be good and to be courageous for God,
That's
and
right.
then when the plague struck, he took off and abandoned you.
The next day, he's gone.
Yeah, and so that did a lot to demoralize the church at that time. Some scholars have suggested that 9 out of 10 clergy who remained contracted the disease and died. Who survived this of the clergy? It was the cowards who survived.
Right.
They were the ones that woke up from this nightmare.
Right.
And they were left standing, and no one trusted these people again.
Right.
Who would trust them?
Right. Who would you want to have a marriage for your daughter?
Right.
This guy that ran off to another country or
Right.
out in the middle of the country to save his own skin, and now he's asking you better go to mass, you
Right.
better do these good things, but
So this destroyed the
Yeah.
parishioners' view of God's justice. You
Yes.
took all the good ones. God, why
Right.
would you do that?
right.
So when the church opened her eyes after the Black Death, she awoke to realize things had changed forever. Very few in many areas knew how to read or write. So there was no one to
So
make
it's not like they were stupid, but they just definitely were not educated like a priest. A priest not only
Right.
was educated, but he also had gone to seminary and also had dedicated his life. It was a mental...
Yeah. Well, and a lot of people
difference
knew how to
also.
read. They just didn't know how to write. And
Right.
think about how this would go. Any civil contracts, the ones that had already been previously written up, no one could read them. The people that took care of things weren't there to enforce civil contracts that were already made. These lords who died, they had many, many people on these vassals on this land.
that they
and
were
peasants
taking care of.
That they
Yeah.
were taking care of.
Yes.
Who was going to come in and make sure that these people didn't...
Now all of a sudden they've just dropped.
Right. You had to have somebody in charge. And all of a sudden, no was in charge. What they went by at that point was the primogeniture law, that the first son inherited the family lands. Okay, so what if there were no men left? So it wasn't just spiritual chaos with no clergy, it was civic chaos too. The bishops left had a huge responsibility. Those who survived were walking around as if like they were in a nightmare. People were suicidal and in despair. There were people thinking to stop the wrath of God, they would walk in huge processions, flagellating their bodies, to where it was recorded that blood flowed down their backs onto the streets. Some went the opposite direction and began mass drinking and had sexual orgies. Some were unable to even move. They were paralyzed by such overwhelming grief of all the deaths in their home.
It's like a total corruption and falling apart of all decent society.
People had to be taken care of, both spiritually and physically. Things needed to return to a semblance of normalcy, which they actually knew would be utterly impossible. So what they did was the bishops would ride through towns asking the civic leaders to choose from among the very best men. They didn't even have a chance. This was done so quickly. There was no vetting of these people. They basically trusted the people in charge of each city who was left.
Be sure to choose a good guy.
Yeah. To just
I'm sure that went over great.
Pick somebody, and they even chose them among very young men. They would just go through and anoint them as priests. There, do it. Just go. Many of these young men.
Well, it sounds like it turned it into a political position. Instead of a theological or a life sacrifice position.
That's right.
Completely changed.
Yeah, they were just, a lot of guys didn't even want to do it. They were just thrown into that position because it had to be filled. And many of these young men had absolutely no knowledge of the scriptures or church doctrines.
Oh, great.
So across the whole of Christendom, the clergy that arose from this crisis bore no resemblance to what there had been before. Many of the men chosen were those who volunteered, or the princes grabbed them and told them they had to be, and then the princes could manipulate them. So you're absolutely right. It turned into a lot of corruption from just the position that the people were put in at the moment.
Right. And, when you get this falling apart of this, even the people who were there, let's say they didn't run, becomes very tempting. It's a very tempting thing to make it about money.
Yeah.
And become greedy. And then the ones who came in that aren't coming in because they love humanity and want to serve the Lord in the church, they really take advantage of it and become a money machine for them in many ways.
It was despicable because some of these priests realized they could price gouge during this crisis. Right. And they actually charged up to 10 times for just giving the sacraments and doing what a priest normally did. But because they could kind of hold them, they actually could hold the sacraments as hostage. Right. So it was really a terrible time. So you can see where the people that were left were thinking horrible things of the church, and so they should have. It was so bad. The bishops petitioned the local governments to set price caps on clergy services, which in turn caused the priests to preach against the greedy bishops in their homilies. And they said, it's the greedy bishops who want all the money. Okay, and they even incited the people to stop the church's interference. And this was the very first understood separation of church and state because of the greedy priests who had arisen that were bad.
Right. And to clarify, these are specific priests and specific cardinals and bishops. This isn't the church sanctioning all this stuff that's going on.
No.
They don't know that a lot of it's going on, and the stuff that they do know is pretty widespread, and they're fighting it, but it's going to take a while to get back.
There were 3 major waves of plague that went through Europe at this time after several decades. And so we're talking about, it was a good 100 years of culling out. This plague was culling out the best of men, the best priests, and leaving after each cycle these terrible priests. Right. And so now the church was full of the weakest of men. So the people considered themselves first and foremost during Christendom at this time Christians. But after the Black Death, it seemed the church had died, and with it, God himself. Everything fell apart. There had been little city-states up to this time. Nationalism and patriotism would only develop after the Black Death had ravaged the confidence of Christians. Because remember, they had ideas of being family. Christendom was first and foremost a family, and now their family became their nation, and hence patriotism. They felt like God's wrath had fallen upon a corrupt church.
Right. He's given them a good smack now.
Mm-hmm.
And
God ready to cast the church aside and start anew. Is that what was happening? Was this the pre-Reformation Reformation?
Not if you go by the Bible. I mean, the Bible says he's not going to leave.
That's right.
No matter what. Just like St. Peter. He didn't leave St. Peter because he denied him 3 times or Doubting Thomas or any of the other disciples who were imperfect, he stayed with them.
Yeah.
He even stayed with Judas.
See, this church that seemed to collapse in front of everybody, God was calling for reformation and renewal in his church. God was calling for good men to step up and become the heroes, to replace the heroes who had died.
Right.
It was the time of Reformation.
Right. It was reforming. I mean, we have, to recap, I mean, we have all these, what I like to call Black Death priests and all the other people of the church that either ran away or came in as kids, didn't know anything when they were thrown in there to be manipulated by the local establishment with no theological training. And we no longer saw the priests as our shepherds. So we had this tidal wave of Black Death priests. Trust was lost and it just fell apart. The word is telling you that you're reforming something. You're not leaving or trashing or getting rid of something.
Right.
You're reforming what is there. You know, Catholics have made reform from the very beginning. They invented reform. They are reformers.
Right. And so when we look at the Black Death, it fundamentally changed the church. But it did instigate a brand new wave of reformers that we saw throughout that time, even into what they called the Reformation. Catholic religious orders were reforming, such as the Capuchins, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, even the Augustinians, which Luther had joined, were a reform order. This is how we'd like to leave this. If you see problems in the church today, don't jump ship. Even if it is the Black Death, the priestly scandal, whatever it is, remember that God is calling you to think like a Catholic in history. Look at the Catholic history and think like a Catholic and be a great man. Because if you think like a reformer, then you're Catholic and you don't know it.
Amen.
This is the surprise ending.